Betrayal unleashed. Our trusted babysitter invades our home with strangers. Cameras catch her lounging, ignoring our kid. Neighborhood drama erupts. Hiring Anna felt like a godsend at the time. She was 23, with a resume that practically screamed competence, years of babysitting experience, glowing references from families I knew around the neighborhood, and a rate that didn't make my wallet flinch. My spouse and I had been drowning trying to keep up with our 4-year-old daughter, a tiny tornado of energy who could wear us down faster than we'd ever admit. We needed help, and Anna seemed like the solution to every exhausted argument about balancing work, parenting, and the faint dream of a quiet evening. Her first day sealed the deal. She showed up right on schedule, backpack slung over her shoulder, her smile warm and reassuring. My daughter latched onto her instantly, trailing her around the house, giggling at every silly game Anna pulled out of nowhere. I came home that night to a lightness I hadn't felt in months, relief flooding through me as I realized we'd found someone I could actually trust. For 2 months, everything was flawless. Anna arrived without fail, her easygoing vibe settling over the house like a blanket. She'd text me little updates, how my daughter had eaten all her veggies or built a lopsided block tower that nearly toppled over. I'd walk through the door to a clean kitchen, my little girl asleep in bed, and a sense that life was finally manageable. My spouse couldn't stop raving about how Anna seemed to get us, leaving the living room untouched, toys stacked neatly, cushions perfectly fluffed. Friends who'd recommended her kept popping into my head, how they'd called her reliable, a natural with kids, the best choice we could have made. Those first 8 weeks were a dream, a stretch of calm where Anna didn't just meet my hopes but blew past them in ways that felt almost surreal. Looking back, that should have tipped me off. Nothing's that perfect without something lurking underneath, and those first cracks were already there, even if I was too relieved to notice. After those perfect 2 months, things started shifting in ways I couldn't quite pin down. It began with the food. I'd open the fridge some mornings and notice stuff missing, half a container of leftovers I'd planned for lunch, a few slices of deli meat, even a bag of frozen chicken nuggets my daughter loved. At first, I brushed it off as my own forgetfulness, figuring I'd miscounted or my spouse had grabbed something on the way out. But then the furniture caught my eye. The armchair in the living room would be angled just off from where I'd left it, facing the TV instead of the window. The coffee table shifted a few inches one night, scraping faint marks into the hardwood I hadn't noticed before. I'd stare at those little changes, my stomach tightening, wondering if I was imagining things. Then came the hair, long, dark strands draped across the couch cushions, too coarse and unfamiliar to belong to me, my spouse, or my daughter's fine blonde curls. One night, I found a single strand tangled in the TV remote, glinting under the lamplight, and my pulse quickened. It wasn't much, but it was enough to make my skin prickle. And I had answers every time I brought it up. The food? She'd say my daughter had been extra hungry, polishing off snacks I hadn't seen her touch in weeks. The furniture? She'd shrug it off as my little girl playing pretend, dragging things around in some game I never witnessed. The hair? She'd point to her own head, claiming it must have shed while she was wrestling my daughter onto the couch for a nap. Her explanations were smooth, delivered with that same easy confidence I'd trusted from the start. They made sense on the surface, logical enough to quiet my nagging thoughts for a day or two. But something gnawed at me. The way her eyes flicked away for a split second before she answered, the way the pieces fit together just a little too neatly. I'd lie awake at night, replaying her words, feeling that itch of doubt grow into something heavier. My spouse noticed it too, catching my gaze over breakfast as we silently tallied up the oddities. We didn't say it out loud yet, but the trust I'd built around Anna was fraying, thread by thread, and I couldn't shake the sense that something or someone was hiding behind her perfect excuses. The unease kept building until my wife couldn't take it anymore. She insisted we install video surveillance cameras, her voice tight with a mix of worry and determination I couldn't argue against. I felt it too, that prickling sense that something was slipping out of our control, right under our own roof. We'd both lain awake too many nights, piecing together the missing food, the shifted furniture, those stray hairs that didn't belong. My wife was the one who finally said it. Cameras would give us peace of mind, a way to watch over our daughter when we couldn't. I agreed, though my gut twisted at the thought of turning our home into a place that needed watching. We settled on placing them in the common areas, the hallway and the living room, spots where our 4-year-old spent most of her time with Anna. It wasn't about spying, I told myself. It was about safety, about knowing for sure that the trust we'd placed in Anna wasn't misplaced. We didn't hide it from her. Before her next shift, I pulled Anna aside and explained the plan. I kept my tone light, framing it as a precaution for our daughter's sake, something any parent might do. My wife stood nearby, arms crossed, her eyes fixed on Anna's face like she was searching for a crack in that calm exterior. Anna nodded along, her expression unruffled, saying all the right things about understanding and supporting our choice. She even smiled, That same warm curve of her lips I'd once found so reassuring. But I couldn't shake the flicker of something in her eyes. Too quick to name. Gone before I could be sure it was real. We set the cameras up that weekend, small black domes blending into the corners of the rooms. My wife tested the app on her phone, the grainy feed flickering to life, showing the empty living room bathed in afternoon light. I watched over her shoulder, my chest tight with a mix of relief and dread. It felt like we were taking back control, but part of me wondered what we'd see when the footage rolled in. The house was quiet that night, my daughter asleep upstairs, the cameras silently watching. I tried to sleep, but my mind wouldn't settle, kept spinning with what-ifs, imagining shapes moving in the shadows of those feeds. My wife reached for my hand in the dark, her grip firm, and I knew she felt it too. We'd opened a door we couldn't close, and whatever was waiting on the other side was about to step into the light. 3 days. That's all it took for the cameras to peel back the mask I'd been too blind to see through. My wife and I had gotten into a shaky routine, checking the footage each morning over coffee, half expecting nothing, half dreading what we might find. On that third day, I sat at the kitchen table, my phone propped up as the app loaded the living room feed from the night before. My daughter's toys were scattered in the corner, just as I'd left them, but then the timestamp rolled past 7 p.m., and my breath caught. Anna appeared on screen, crossing the room with that familiar casual stride, except she wasn't alone. A guy followed her in, tall and lanky, his face unfamiliar, his boots tracking faint dirt across my rug. My stomach lurched as I watched him shut the door behind him like he owned the place, Anna trailing him toward the kitchen without a glance back. The footage kept rolling, and every frame tightened the knot in my chest. They rummaged through my fridge, pulling out the chicken I'd bought for Sunday dinner, the jar of salsa my wife loved, even the last of my daughter's juice boxes. Anna moved like it was her kitchen, tossing a pan onto the stove while the guy leaned against the counter, cracking open one of my beers. They cooked together, the smell of sizzling meat practically wafting through the screen as I sat there, frozen, my coffee going cold. Then they carried their plates, piled with my food, back to the living room, plopping onto my couch like it was their personal lounge. Anna kicked her feet up on the coffee table, the same one I'd noticed shifted before, while the guy sprawled out, flicking on my TV. My daughter wasn't even in the frame. No sign of her playing, no hint she'd been tended to. Just the two of them, eating, laughing, living in my home while I paid Anna to care for my child. I rewound the clip, my hands shaking, hoping I'd missed something that would make it less damning. But it only got worse. The timestamp showed hours passing, hours of them lounging, ignoring the job I'd trusted her with. My wife came up behind me, her gasp sharp in the silence as she saw the screen. We didn't need words. The betrayal burned through us both, raw and heavy. Anna hadn't just crossed a line. She turned our house into her playground, and that realization hit me harder than I'd ever expected. The cameras had done their job, but now I had to face what they'd shown me, and the weight of it was suffocating. The next morning hit me like a punch I couldn't dodge. My wife and I barely slept, the images from the previous night's footage seared into our minds. Anna and that guy treating our home like their personal retreat. I told myself it couldn't get worse, that maybe it was a one-off, a fluke we'd caught on camera. But when I pulled up the feed from the night before, my hands trembling over my phone, the truth slammed into me harder than ever. There they were again, Anna and her boyfriend, sprawled across my couch like they'd never left. The living room glowed with the flicker of my TV, Netflix scrolling through options I hadn't picked, their legs tangled together under a blanket I'd bought for my daughter. My stomach churned as I watched them sink deeper into the cushions, their empty plates stacked on the coffee table, more of my food, no doubt, while the clock ticked past 8 p.m. Then the nursery camera feed loaded, and my heart sank. My 4-year-old daughter was there, alone, surrounded by her toys in a dim corner of the room. She sat cross-legged on the rug, stacking blocks into a wobbly tower, her little face focused but unguarded, no one watching, no one caring. The sight of her playing by herself, ignored while Anna lounged downstairs, sent a wave of nausea through me. I zoomed in, my chest tightening as I saw her glance toward the door once, twice, like she was waiting for someone who never came. Downstairs, Anna and the guy didn't even flinch, lost in their show, their cozy little night, as if my daughter didn't exist. Hours passed on the timestamp, her small figure moving from blocks to crayons, alone in the silence, while they stretched out in my living room, oblivious or uncaring. My wife leaned over my shoulder, her breath hitching as the footage played. The shock from the day before had been bad, but this was a gut wound, seeing my little girl left to fend for herself while I paid Anna to protect her. My hands clenched into fists, the phone screen blurring as anger and guilt crashed over me. I trusted her, let her into our lives, and she'd turned our home into her hangout, leaving my daughter to drift in the background. It wasn't just betrayal anymore. It was neglect, stark and undeniable, staring back at me from the grainy feeds. My wife's hand found mine, her grip fierce, and I knew we couldn't let this slide another day. The weight of it all was crushing, but the fire building inside me was stronger. The footage from that night snapped something inside me. I couldn't sit still, couldn't wait another second with that betrayal looping in my head. Anna and her boyfriend sprawled on my couch, my daughter abandoned upstairs. My wife's eyes met mine over the kitchen table, her face pale but resolute, and I knew what I had to do. I grabbed my keys, the anger boiling under my skin as I drove home, the mid-morning sun harsh against my windshield. Every mile fueled the fire, images of my little girl playing alone, ignored, while Anna played house with some guy in my living room. I didn't care that it was early, that Anna wasn't expecting me. I needed answers, needed to see her face when I called her out on what the cameras had caught. I pulled into the driveway, my pulse hammering, and stormed through the front door. There they were, Anna and the guy still in my living room, the TV humming faintly, a half-empty bag of my daughter's goldfish crackers spilled across the coffee table. Anna jumped up from the couch, her eyes wide, the guy scrambling to his feet behind her. My daughter was nowhere in sight, probably still tucked away in the nursery, and that only stoked the fury churning in my chest. Anna stepped forward, her hands raised like she could calm the storm barreling toward her. She started talking fast, words tumbling out about how this was her fiancé, how he'd only stopped by for lunch, how it wasn't a big deal. Her voice was steady, that same polished confidence I'd once trusted, but her excuses felt hollow, flimsy against the weight of what I'd seen. I stood there, fists clenched, watching her weave her story, how he just popped in, how they'd only eaten what was already open, how my daughter was fine upstairs. The guy hovered behind her, shifting on his feet, his presence an insult in my home. Every syllable she spat out clashed with the footage burned into my mind. Hours of them lounging, cooking, ignoring my child, not some quick lunch break. My gaze darted to the kitchen counter, spotting my cutting board streaked with sauce, my beer bottles in the trash. The lie was so blatant it almost choked me, and yet she kept going, her eyes pleading for me to buy it. My wife's text buzzed in my pocket. Did you find them? And I felt the ground shift beneath me. This wasn't just a slip-up. It was a violation, and Anna's smooth talking wasn't going to bury it. The confrontation had only begun, and the air between us crackled with what came next. The air in the living room felt thick, suffocating, as Anna's excuses hung between us. I couldn't listen to another word, her story about a quick lunch crumbling under the weight of what I knew. My phone burned in my hand, the footage ready to end the charade. I pulled it out, my fingers steady despite the rage pulsing through me, and opened the app. The screen lit up with the living room feed, timestamps glaring back at me 4 to 5 hours a day, every day that week, of Anna and her boyfriend camped out in my home. I turned the phone toward her, letting the clips play, them cooking my food, lounging on my couch, flicking through Netflix while my daughter sat alone upstairs. The evidence rolled on, undeniable, hour after hour of them treating my house like their private getaway, my trust shredded frame by frame. Anna's face changed as the footage played. Her confidence cracked, her eyes darting from the screen to me, then to the guy still lingering behind her. She stepped closer, her hands trembling now, and the tears started big, messy ones spilling down her cheeks. She crumpled onto the couch, her shoulders shaking, her whole demeanor shifting from calm to desperate. She began pleading, her voice breaking as she explained, they had nowhere else to meet, no place of their own, and my house had been their only option. She swore it hadn't started out that way, that it just happened, that she'd never meant to let it go so far. Her fiancé stood silent, head down, as she begged for a second chance, promising she'd stop, that she'd make it right if I just let her keep the job. Her sobs filled the room, raw and jagged, tugging at something in me despite the anger still simmering under my skin. I stood there, phone still in hand, the clips looping silently now. My daughter's toys sat untouched in the corner, a quiet reminder of who'd been forgotten in all this. My wife's text from earlier flashed in my mind, she can't stay, and I knew it was over. Anna's tears couldn't erase the hours of neglect, the violation of my home, my family. I felt a flicker of pity for her, trapped in her own mess, but it drowned under the weight of what she'd done. The guy shuffled toward the door, avoiding my gaze, and Anna's cries grew louder, her hands reaching out like she could pull back the trust she'd torched. I turned away, my decision hardening. She was done here, and no amount of begging could change that. Firing Anna felt final, like slamming a door I'd never reopen. She left that day with tear-streaked cheeks, her fiancé trailing behind, and I thought that was the end of it. My wife and I spent the evening cleaning up, wiping down the couch, tossing out half-empty snack bags, trying to scrub away the violation that lingered in our home. But the quiet didn't last. By the next morning, my phone buzzed with a notification, a new review posted on the local babysitting site where we'd found Anna. My stomach dropped as I read it. She'd painted us as monsters, cruel, Distrustful employers who'd installed cameras to spy on her, who'd overreacted to a harmless visit from her fiancé. Every word twisted the truth, her version of events so warped I barely recognized it, yet sharp enough to sting. She called us controlling, accused us of humiliating her, claimed we'd ruined her reputation over nothing. It didn't stop there. My wife's phone lit up next, texts from other parents in the neighborhood, forwarded messages Anna had sent out like poison darts. She'd reached out to families we knew, ones who'd recommended her, spinning the same story. We were paranoid, heartless, the kind of people who'd punish a hard-working sitter for no reason. Some parents replied with sympathy for her. I saw the names pop up, folks we'd waved to at preschool drop-offs, shared coffee with at park playdates, and felt my chest tighten. A few questioned us directly, their tones clipped, asking why we treated Anna so harshly. Others stayed silent, but the distance was palpable, a shift in the air I couldn't ignore. My wife scrolled through the messages, her face paling, while I refreshed that review page, watching the likes pile up under Anna's post. The lies spread fast, a web tightening around us, and I realized she wasn't just hurt, she was out for revenge. I paced the living room, the same spot where she'd lounged with her boyfriend, my anger flaring anew. My daughter played upstairs, oblivious, but I felt the weight of those accusations pressing down, cruel, distrustful, unfair. We trusted her, paid her, welcomed her into our lives, and now she'd turned our neighbors against us with a few keystrokes. My wife's hand brushed mine, her eyes fierce despite the worry, and I knew we couldn't let this stand. Anna had lit the match, but the fire was spreading, and I had to figure out how to stamp it out before it consumed us completely. The fallout from Anna's smear campaign hit harder than I'd expected. It wasn't just whispers or sideways glances anymore. Some parents from my daughter's kindergarten started openly backing her. I caught wind of it first at drop-off one morning, spotting a cluster of moms near the gate, their heads bent together, voices low but pointed. My skin prickled as I overheard snippets how Anna and her fiancé were just a young couple trying to be together, how he'd been too harsh, too cold to kick her out over something so innocent. Their words twisted the knife, painting her as some star-crossed lover and us as the villains who'd crushed her dreams. I kept my head down, guiding my daughter through the gate, but the weight of their stares followed me back to the car, heavy and accusing. My wife felt it worse. Her phone buzzed nonstop that day, messages piling up from numbers she recognized, parents we'd chatted with at school events, shared snacks with during field trips. The texts weren't subtle. One called her judgmental, saying she'd overreacted to a harmless situation. Another suggested she lacked compassion, that Anna deserved better than being tossed aside like trash. A third went further, accusing us of bullying a young woman who couldn't afford her own place. Cruelty dressed up as parenting. My wife read them aloud to me, her voice steady at first, then cracking as the venom sank in. She'd scroll through each one, her fingers hovering over the screen, torn between replying and deleting them outright. I saw the hurt in her eyes, the way her shoulders slumped, and it fueled the frustration clawing at me. These people didn't know the half of it. Hours of footage, my daughter left alone, but their pity for Anna drowned out any chance of reason. The kindergarten became a battleground. Drop-offs turned tense, parents splitting into silent camps, some nodding at us awkwardly, others turning away, their loyalty clear. My wife stopped checking her messages after one particularly nasty note questioned her as a mother, and I felt the rift widening, our little world fracturing under Anna's lies. My daughter skipped along, unaware, but I couldn't shake the anger, at Anna for starting this, at these parents for buying it, at myself for letting it spiral this far. The drama swelled around us, a storm we couldn't outrun, and I knew we had to fight back before it swallowed everything we'd built. The drama had stretched us thin, but the cameras still held one last blow. Late one night, my wife and I sat hunched over my phone, combing through older footage, desperate for something to turn the tide. That's when we found it, a clip from weeks back, buried in the archives. Anna and her boyfriend weren't alone this time. 3 more figures filled my living room, unfamiliar faces laughing as they carried takeout bags and bottles of wine, my wine, into the kitchen. The timestamp stretched late into the night, showing them sprawled across my furniture, picking through my cabinets, turning our home into their dinner party spot. My daughter's nursery feed flickered on the split screen, her small shape asleep in her crib, oblivious to the strangers downstairs. My blood ran cold, then hot, the betrayal sinking deeper than ever. This wasn't just a couple sneaking time together. It was a full-blown invasion, and I'd had enough. I didn't hesitate. I clipped the clearest segment, 2 minutes of them laughing, clinking glasses, lounging like they owned the place, and uploaded it to the kindergarten parents' chat. My fingers hovered over the send button, my wife nodding beside me, her jaw tight. The video went out with a short note. This is what we found. No explanations, no pleas, just the truth, raw and undeniable. The chat went silent, the barrage of messages that had haunted us for days vanishing in an instant. By morning, apologies trickled in, tentative at first, then firm. Parents who'd sided with Anna backtracked, their tone shifting to shock, some even outrage. The complaints dissolved, the accusations fading as the footage spoke louder than Anna's lies ever could. I felt the knot in my chest loosen, a fragile relief settling in as our name cleared, piece by piece. We didn't waste time. The new nanny started the next week. Older, no nonsense. With references we triple-checked. My wife drafted a contract, crisp and clear, with a clause banning outsiders from the house, no exceptions. She signed it without a blink, her steady presence a stark contrast to Anna's chaos. My daughter took to her quickly, the house settling into a quiet I hadn't realized I'd missed. The cameras stayed up, feeds checked less out of fear now and more out of habit. Anna's shadow lingered, but it was fading, the storm she'd unleashed finally breaking. We'd fought through it. Messy, bruised, but standing, and that was enough.